Sorry. That's good. Margot has a pair of reading glasses for me in case I need them.
Oh, I can't read a thing.
Yeah, I got it.
Without them.
I can pretend. Check this phone off here. Deep reading glasses.
Leaders and eras, John Lewis, Morningside, and Vine Deloria Jr. this morning. So excited to be sitting with these amazing historians and authors. I have some business before we get to it. The Virginia Festival of the Book is a program of Virginia Humanities, a statewide organization whose mission is to connect people and ideas to explore the human experience. Most festival events are free of charge, but not free to produce. Your support helps us keep this incredible event going year after year. And if you'd like to support the festival, you can give using one of the QR codes designated, found in the back of your brochure. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Book's premier sponsor, Michelle and David Baldacci, who helped make this event possible. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. I'd also like to encourage you to be aware of your space. Take a look around, note the available exits. In the case of an emergency, our site coordinator will be on hand to provide assistance. At the conclusion of the panel, you'll be able to purchase books and the authors will be available to sign a copy for you. And if you are staying for the next panel, we ask that you please allow the site coordinator to scan your registration for that panel. Festival authors and speakers represent themselves. They do not represent Virginia Humanities or the University of Virginia. All right, that's all the business. I'm delighted to welcome our authors, Aran Shetterly, Shelly Wilkins, Raymond, Arsenault, and David E. Wilkins. Aran Shetterly is currently finishing a narrative nonfiction book about the 1979 Greensboro Massacre. This project, under contract with Amistad HarperCollins, has received support from Virginia Humanities and the National Endowment to the Humanities. Raymond Arsenault is the John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History Emeritus at the University of South Florida. He is the author of several award-winning books on civil rights history. His most recent book, published in January 2024 as a volume in Yale University Press's new Black Lives series, is John Lewis in Search of the Beloved Community. David E. Wilkins, Alumni Nation member, is a distinguished professor at the University of Richmond and Minnesota's Emeritus Professor. He's authored over 20 books on Native American political development. Shelly Wilkins, his partner, is an analyst at Wilkins Forum, specializing in tribal state relations, and they co-authored Dismembered. All right. So here we go. We are going to give all of these authors 5 minutes to either read an excerpt from the book or just talk a little bit about what their book is before we get into questions.
Start down there. Work this way.
You don't want to go first, Aran?
Oh, okay. I can go first.
Hi. Good morning. It's great to be here. So I was just talking with these guys a little bit. They said, how did you come to this subject, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre, which very few people seem to know much about, and there are a bunch of reasons for that maybe we'll talk about a little bit. But in 2015, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina. My father had a show of his paintings at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum there that actually Ray helped design. I just found out, which is very exciting. And the woman who organized that show of paintings said, there's 2 people you have to meet. And we went to this little Salvadoran cafe at the edge of downtown Greensboro and waited and waited and waited. And we were just about to walk out when in through the door walked Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife Joyce Johnson. And they told a story that I had never heard before. And as I listened, I couldn't believe I'd never heard it. And that they were radical activists organizing in the mills in Greensboro, North Carolina in the late 70s. And these were still some of the largest textile mills in the whole world. Levi's dungaree jean material came from the mills in Greensboro for 100 years. And they were struggling to organize a cross race. They wanted to bring white and black and other people who were working in, I'm sure there were some Native people working in those mills, I bet, together. And they felt that possibly the Klan was organizing in these mills too and trying to keep the union drives desegregated. And so they decided to hold a march against racism and to describe how keeping poor people of different backgrounds apart made the demands that they could make of management in these factories much weaker, and why it was important to come together and what those strategies had meant over the years, right? And how people had been disempowered by the divisiveness. So they were setting up, and they called this march the March Against the Klan and a Conference on Racism, but they had a nickname which was called Death to the Klan. And they were chanting and singing songs and putting up these posters and getting ready, and a caravan of Klansmen and neo-Nazis drove up, picked a fight, started a stick fight, started shooting, and in 88 seconds, 5 people were dead and another dozen injured. And it became known as the Greensboro Massacre. So this is what I'm learning. I'm sitting there in the cafe learning this information. And then I learned that no one was ever held criminally responsible. And these trials went all the way to 1985. And I thought, how is that possible? You know, and one of the things this did, and we were just talking about this a little bit, is it's so late. Like if you told this story and said it in 1949, we would find it easier to understand. But 1979, after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and you know, after what we call the classical civil rights movement, this seemed hard to comprehend. And so one of the things is, in my title, I call it Morningside. Morningside was the name of the public housing development where this shooting took place. And one of the reasons the activists didn't believe the Klan would show up, despite some of their rhetoric and provocations, was that this was a black housing development. And their march was in the middle of the day. And they thought, they're not going to show up in a black part of town where they've never been in the middle of the day. And the reason I say struggle for an American city's soul is, what is America? And who do we want to be? And I think that this event frames a conversation about that and what these activists who called themselves communists were trying to do, and in some ways, how very American what they wanted was, right, in terms of deeper equality, but wondered how fundamental the changes were that we had to make in order to actually achieve that, versus the sort of repressive elements that wanted to limit how we could achieve that, if we could achieve that, pay lip service to it, but not actually realize it. And so I'm sitting there listening to this conversation, and then they tell me that not only did this happen, not only did these lawsuits happen, in which the shooters were acquitted, but there was a mystery, which was, why didn't law enforcement prevent this violence? Turns out that the police had an informant in the Klan, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had an infiltrator in the Nazi group, and the FBI was listening to all of these folks. They had the information they needed to have prevented it, and they didn't do it. And so that's something I had to really grapple with in this story. And then the last thing I'll say was about that is that this was the first place in the United States that brought a truth and reconciliation process to deal with past history on the South African model. There have been some other experiments with talking about the past and trying to reckon with it. But this Bishop Tutu, Desmond Tutu came over. People from that South African process were directly involved in what happened in Greensboro. And they had this extraordinary process that ran for 2 years of public forums in Greensboro in which Klansmen and activists and police officers and lawyers who were connected to this and community members got up and talked about what their histories were. And they produced this remarkable document that was critical to my research, that not many people have read, but exists and is a way of guarding history, you know? And it's so important right now that we hold on to these histories so that when we're ready to listen to them, we can. And so while I was working on this book in 2020, the Greensboro City Council called a special meeting and apologized for their part in the city's part in the violence that happened that day and admitted that their police force could have prevented the violence. It was a pretty powerful moment. And not only did they do that, they named a scholarship in the names of 5 slain communists for high school students in Greensboro who are interested in social justice. Pretty chilling and wonderful moment to witness over Zoom because it was in the depths of COVID. But what really got my imagination going in that cafe was the hopeful, ongoing struggle that the Johnsons continued to participate in, and their lack of cynicism, despite all this difficult history, all the trauma they carried, all the setbacks they'd had, and that they were still out there. And they have a center in Greensboro called the Beloved Community Center. And this is where their histories, which in some ways are so different from John Lewis's, intersect with some of his ideas later in their lives. And Nelson Johnson just died about 7 weeks ago. It's a huge loss. He was truly one of the country's greatest grassroots organizers, and that impact will be felt in unions and racial justice groups and other social justice organizations all around the country.
Okay. Well, good morning. I was here 6 years ago in this room, I think, to talk about my biography of Arthur Ashe, and had a wonderful experience. I'm really glad to be back. She suggested that we only speak for 5 minutes. It's not easy to do that on John Lewis, I must confess. But this was my 12th book, almost certainly my last book. And I know it's not a good idea to say that, but it meant a lot to me. John Lewis was a dear friend of mine. We had a 20-year friendship. I met him when I was researching my book on the Freedom Riders, and he in fact was the first interview of more than 250 interviews that I did. And I was very nervous. In his office, which is like a little civil rights museum, or was, in Washington. And immediately I realized that I was dealing with a human being at a level that I had never met before. He was really, I can say, the most extraordinary human being that I've met in my lifetime. And I spent a lot of time with civil rights activists over the years. But John was really special. When he was elected to Congress in 1986, the New York Times did a profile of all the new Congress people, and they said, well, John's the only one that has the saint problem. Everyone thinks he's a saint, and he has to live up to that. And of course his friends started teasing him, calling him St. John, and he said, he was a very modest man, no apparent sense of ego or he was really selfless, and I saw him in so many situations where he always seemed to have the right words, even though, as you may know, I'm sure you've heard his speeches from time to time, he had a bit of a lisp. He had a deep South Alabama accent. He was kind of conscious of that. He actually said, I'm not really a man of words, I'm a man of action. But he was really adept at words, and in fact, his career as an activist began in Pike County, Alabama, where he was from. He's out of dirt, poverty, one of 10 children, no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no paved roads. He was 10 miles from Troy, which is a fairly substantial city in that area of Alabama. But Martin Luther King used to call him the boy from Troy. But he really wasn't from Troy. He was from, it could have been another planet as far as it was in those days. But John really devoted his life from the age of 16 on to this search for the beloved community. And by that, it's a term that was coined back in 1913 by Josiah Royce, a philosopher, used by Gandhi, used by almost all of the kind of pacifists and activists of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Martin Luther King, of course, and James Lawson, but John made it his own. Became associated with the beloved community, which he really is kind of a utopian sense of a world that's devoted to love and inclusiveness, to DEI, really. I shouldn't use that term, I guess, these days. Get in trouble, but it's good trouble, right? That's what John's favorite phrase. You got to get in good trouble. You have to stand up for what you believe in, regardless of the consequences. But he had this extraordinary life, an extraordinary career. He became one of the original 13 Freedom Riders, and that's how I met him. I was interviewing for my book at the age of 21. He was one of those Freedom Riders that made his last will and testament before he got on the bus, because he didn't really think he would be coming back. Going into the kind of heart of darkness, daring the Klan to stop them from sitting in the front of the bus or sitting down at a lunch counter like everybody else. And he suffered his first beating in Rock Hill, South Carolina, after the first week of the first Freedom Ride. That was the first of more than 40 beatings that he had during his career. In these later years, he lost his hair, and you could see almost every mark from these beatings in his skull, several skull fractures. He was also arrested and incarcerated more than 40 times, 5 times while he was in Congress. That's kind of a record, I think. He always had bandages on his head, and he was a man of extraordinary moral and physical courage. And he never sort of took his eyes off the prize in the sense of fighting for reconciliation, for compassion, for generosity. He became a congressman, 17 terms. In fact, in 1965, Bayard Rustin, the great Gandhian intellectual, wrote a wonderful essay called Protest to Politics. And he was saying, even though he had spent his whole life as an organizer, he said, now's the time to start trying to get elected, to try to fight from inside the system as well as outside the system, not just in the streets in nonviolent direct action, but actually getting elected. Actually, very few civil rights leaders did that. And John's the primary one. As I'm sure you remember, Jesse Jackson ran for president twice, but was unsuccessful. But John had a whole nother career after being the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from the time he was 23 years old, one of the major speakers at the March on Washington in 1963. Of course, I'm sure you probably know about Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 when he was nearly beaten to death by state patrol when he tried to lead 600 marchers across the bridge. Of course, they did have the march all the way to Montgomery from Selma. It took 5 days. John was in the hospital after being beaten, but he insisted on going on the march. And he made a compromise with the doctors that he'd march during the day, and then they'd drive him back to the hospital in Selma at night. And he made it all the way and gave this glorious speech on the steps of the Capitol with George Wallace peeking out of the window, listening to him and Dr. King. There's so many stories to tell. I'll just tell one because I know we have limited time. It's really the moment I decided I had to write this book. John had become a good friend, and I'd known him for years, but I think I really got to know him best when we were actually on the Oprah show together. This is kind of the high point of my career. I could have won a Nobel Prize, and my colleagues would not be more impressed. My book on the Freedom Rides was made into an American Experience documentary. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's been seen by more than 70 million people around the world. We won 3 Emmys and a Peabody. Stanley Nelson was a wonderful African-American filmmaker, kind of the Black Ken Burns, he's called sometimes. I worked with him for 3 years on this film, and it was really quite extraordinary. And we sent a DVD to Oprah. Within 15 minutes, she called Stanley and crying over the phone and saying, I just never knew this story about the Freedom Riders, how brave they were, how extraordinary it was, how they changed the world. She should have known, as she said, because her father's a barber who lives in Nashville, where many of the Freedom Riders lived, and he would cut their hair. And she knew some of the Freedom Riders as a young girl, but she just never sort of absorbed the story. So she felt guilty. She only had 4 shows left. She's ending her show. But she said, I got to devote one of them to the Freedom Rides. And sure enough, she did. She flew 180 Freedom Riders and their families in at her expense. We had a 5-day conference on civil rights, looking back at the Freedom Rides. And it was really quite extraordinary. But there was this moment, I met with her producer, and they said, well, this is kind of a dark story of Klansmen trying to burn people to death on a bus. Have you got any reconciliation stories? It's Oprah, right? Have you got a reformed Klansman? Somebody who's now a civil rights activist who used to be a Klansman. So I said, well, we actually do. Actually, we got just what you want. There's a man named Elwyn Wilson. He was a kind of a Klansman in training in 1961, the year of the Freedom Rides in Rock Hill, and he gave John his first bad beating. They got off the bus and they were going into the terminal in Rock Hill, and pretty rough town if you've been there, kind of a Klan-infested town, and they beat him pretty badly. Mr. Wilson, of course, went on with his life. He was 24 at the time. He left the Klan, he got religion, he got married, he had a family, and he always felt guilty about what he'd done to John Lewis. Later, John became famous, of course, and everybody knew who he was. And so fast forward to 2009, it's Barack Obama's first inauguration, and who's sitting right behind him, as he takes the oath of office? John Lewis. So Mr. Wilson saw John, and just on a kind of a whim, he calls John's office to apologize for what he'd done to him many years before, and he never expected John to answer the phone. That's the kind of congressman he was. He did everything but sweep the floors. Completely democratic sensibility. Anyway, So he's crying over the phone and saying, I'm so sorry what I did to you. I just don't know where my head was at. I just felt awful about this. Will you please forgive me? And of course, well, John Lewis is all about forgiveness, right? So he says, of course I'll forgive you. And they're crying and praying together over the phone. And I think with most people, that would have been the end of it, but not with John Lewis. So he invites Mr. Wilson up to Washington to have a kind of face-to-face, meeting. And once again, they're praying and crying together, and they became friends. So when we needed this reconciliation story, we said, well, we got Mr. Wilson. So we flew him up. Now he's in his 70s. He's in very bad health. He's not a well-educated man, not well-spoken. He was incredibly nervous. And so they would have two people at a time, a series of interviews on the show. You can watch it on YouTube, actually. It's still available. So I'm sitting here, and John's to my left. I'm off camera. There's John here, and then Mr. Wilson. So I have a ringside seat to see what's going on. So Oprah asks her first question to Mr. Wilson, and he just freezes. I mean, there's nothing coming out of his mouth. And so she sort of gulps and asks him another question. And it looked like he was just going to implode. He was just about to bolt from the stage. He was terrified. There were probably 20 million people watching this, and he's surrounded by freedom riders, the people he hated back in 1961. We kept telling him, no, they're all about forgiveness, and nobody's going to say anything bad to you. Nobody's going to hurt you. But he was incredibly nervous, and I can see why. So he's just about to run. And John, I think instinctively, reaches out with his left hand and grabs Mr. Wilson's right hand, and in a voice which everybody in the studio could hear, he says, he's my brother. He's my brother. And for me, that'll always be the quintessential John Lewis, a sense of generosity and forgiveness, and he just, it was such an act of love, really, to a man who beat him insensibly, many years before. But that's what John Lewis was all about, and I think that's why he's had such an extraordinary legacy and why we all wish he was still around today. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. My wife and I are glad to be here. And the only reason I'm speaking first is because I'm just going to provide the context, the setup for her to get into our book. I knew Vine from the time I was a college freshman back in the Jurassic Age. And I had read his first major book, Custer Died for Your Sins, which was a bestseller. He did a follow-up book called God is Red, a comparative study of native religions and indigenous and Western religion. And he just had a fantastic influence on my life and the life of all indigenous peoples and other communities of color. Again, we don't have much time, but I can tell you that I studied under Vine. I did my master's under him, and we later became good friends. I had the good fortune of co-authoring one book with him before he passed away in 2005. And then after he passed, we had started a second book, a comparative study of the various racial and ethnic groups and how the legal system in the United States diminishes their status. I finished that after he passed, which was really difficult to do because he was the brilliant person. I was just sort of the foot soldier to him. And then that led me to, after he passed, to put together a book that sort of focused on his broad ideas. Vine's work really provided the foundation, the intellectual and the rhetorical foundation upon which the indigenous Renaissance began in the late 1960s. Vine published over 30 books, and he wrote hundreds of articles, testified before Congress many times. His background, he was a lawyer by training, but he had a theological degree. He came from a long line of Episcopal priests in his family. He studied that, but decided he wanted to focus on the legal and political situation of indigenous peoples. And his work really provided the language that we used and we continue to use as Native nations have rebuilt their communities in the last, since the 1970s when self-determination became a thing. Three major concepts really sort of connect much of what he did. The concept of indigenous sovereignty, that is a right of Native peoples to be self-governing. The concept of self-determination, which is a muscle that enables Native nations to exercise their inherent powers. And the concept of environmental sacredness, that the earth is alive and that we are dependent upon the earth, and that if we don't modify our ways, we're going to be destroyed. And when you look at the climate change, look at all the problems that we're having across the globe because of the way we've misused our relationship to the lands and the waters and the air. He was really way ahead of his time. And so when I did the book, Red Prophet, with the great subtitle that my wife came up with, The Punishing Intellectualism of Vine Deloria Jr., I gathered together as many of his ideas, recommendations for reform for both indigenous peoples and for the federal government, and put them together as sort of a working document in the hopes that they might provide people with continuing ways to improve our situation as Native nations. And that book is what led to the current book that my wife and I put together in honor of Vine. So I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Well, as David said, this collection is building upon.
You need it closer.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. As David said, this collection builds upon the work he had done in Red Prophet of coalescing Vine's major ideas. During COVID lockdown, he and I had just moved to Richmond, and we were talking about all the things that were going on in the world. A lot of reservations out west had shut down because they were trying not to have the virus spread to them and endanger their elders. There'd been a lot of activism in Standing Rock. There was just a lot going on, but everybody was isolated. And so we thought, what would Vine do at this time? And how are people using his ideas now to help them through? So we contacted a lot of folks across Indian country, all ages, all backgrounds, to say, what idea does this really important Native philosopher have that's important to you? Or is there an idea you disagree with that could be retooled and reused? So we wanted to build on this idea of continuous knowledge, like taking an idea from someone who's respected, deciding if it's worth carrying forward, can it be retooled and used, or is it something to put away, either forever or for another time? So a lot of Native activists took up the challenge, and we were quite surprised at how enthusiastic they were. And so with that, I'll read a bit from the introduction. In the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis ignited a great movement for justice and change. People across the country fought to reclaim their communities and their rights through direct action. They protested, marched, and toppled statues honoring heroes of white supremacy, refusing to tolerate the hate and violence these monuments symbolized and encouraged. Many so-called great men were unceremoniously dethroned to be melted down, warehoused, or sent to museums where their misdeeds could be studied up close. It was a very good day here in Richmond, Virginia, when a bronze Columbus discovered the bottom of Fountain Lake. In the midst of these events, Indian Country Today, which is the major newspaper firm across tribal nations, asked their readership which Native they believed deserving of a monument to be placed upon these newly unoccupied plinths and pedestals. Standing Rock author, activist, scholar, and philosopher Vine Deloria Jr. was at the top of the list of 10 they chose for this honor. And Vine had been dead about 15 years by this time. While we were sure Vine would have both been flattered and amused by the notion of a Vine shrine, he most certainly would have been taken with the irony of replacing one set of lifeless icons with another. Non-Indigenous folks have long found it fitting to tear rocks from their places in the earth and reshape them into idols. They seem to have no understanding of the slow, enduring memory of the stone beings. Like trees in a forest, all stone, from mountain to pebble, relies upon other stone, melding, stacking, supporting, shifting, There's a constant movement as each fragment of the whole seeks to achieve balance. In the world we used to live in, Vine shared several stories about the power of stones, observing that they, quote, provide a cosmic perspective that the people must always keep in mind. For statue worshippers, this understanding has not merely been lost, but corrupted to such an extent that for them, stone symbolizes not just permanence, but immobility, the death of growth, change, time, and perspective. As we literally look up to those idols looming high on their pedestals, we're supposed to feel humility and gratitude for their extraordinary accomplishments. They are also intimidating reminders of who holds the reins of power. But as we know from Native traditions, there are no new ideas. There are no solitary heroes, and permanence is a fiction. Survival, health, and fulfillment are only attainable through ongoing shared effort and balance. Stories, visions, and instructions for achieving these goals are passed across generations and modified through discussion, community experiences, and trial and error. Knowledge is not linear, nor is it one-dimensional, and it is certainly not property. Knowledge is community, a shared circle where past, present, and future coexist, evolve, and inform one another. Those of us currently occupying the present adopt what is still useful, repurpose ideas to fit current needs, and build upon what we've been given to meaningfully engage with one another and the world we inhabit. I was kind of happy to see this venue because it sort of speaks to what we were working with here about continuous knowledge, because the mission of this school is to honor the legacy of this community and to bring that into the future. So that is continuous knowledge. That's all we're talking about. Reclamation of history is difficult. Even these mainstream ways of honoring are only realized after years of unrelenting advocacy. The very concept of history is under threat as across the country authoritarian movements gain power and attention by attacking anyone who is non-white, non-Christian, non-binary, or differently abled. Evidence of friendship and community building across societal barriers is erased. Centuries of denigration and displacement have taken a grievous toll, and the virulent backlash against efforts to tell stories of all people within the borders of what is now the United States is increasingly violent. For non-Native culture, the very act of creating static monuments is a kind of propagandic death that locks a limited personal story in time. In our combined years of political and legal and historical research, we have yet to come across this type of so-called honoring by Native peoples prior to European encroachment. Although a statue can symbolize an apology or even an affirmation of Indigenous history and presence, elevation of an individual over community has never been part of a long-term strategy for Indigenous peoples. Communities honored their relatives by transforming them into the embodiment of the people, a living tribute to collective survival. So rather than a statue, we believe Vine would have preferred that his tools, decades of research, writing, and activism, be put to real use, not just parroted or lauded, but strenuously critiqued and then either modified for current use or kept as memories of other times. This is the practical way Native peoples have always carried knowledge and tradition forward. Vine was without question a unique talent, smart and seemingly fearless, armed with a razor-sharp sense of humor, and he was in the right place at the right time in history with the voice that could not be ignored. He was at once meticulous, brilliant, ambitious, vain, principled, sarcastic, loyal, stubborn, volatile, and courageous, a complex being just like the rest of us.
Thank you so much for giving everyone a little bit of eye into your book. So I have some overall questions for you. The first one, all of you kind of answered already, which, so what has been the most unexpected reaction to your book, either from someone who read it or from a publisher, or even a reaction that you even had to it being put out in the world? Anybody?
Well, I'll say, before I wrote this book, I knew there was a great affection for John Lewis among many, many people. but I don't think I really fully understood what he meant to people till I started giving lectures on the book. I've done probably 40 or 45 lectures in the past year. And so many people came up to me afterwards with tears in their eyes. You know, they just, I think, felt a void after he died in July of 2020. And I think he's left an incredible legacy, but they'd come up to me and they'd say, who is the new John Lewis? Where can we find another man like this? And I'm not sure I gave them very satisfactory answers because it's not easy. I mean, there are lots of very committed civil rights leaders and foot soldiers, and of course, but I don't know that anyone had such a riveted attention on this beloved community that never wavered. You know, he was just fearless and relentless. And as one of his colleagues, I think it was Steny Hoyer in Congress, said, he had a tough mind and a tender heart, and quite an incredible combination. That he could be very soft-spoken when you talk to him, just in regular conversation. He had that booming voice, and he was a bit of an actor, but it was all about everybody else. It was never about him.
That's a tough question. The book's been out for about a year and a half now, and we wound up with like 38 contributors. And a lot of people knew that Vine was really a Renaissance figure, because even though, like I said, he was trained as a lawyer and a theologian, he wrote across many disciplines: law, politics, history, education, cultural criticism, philosophy, social movements. He was writing about geology near the end, as well as at the beginning of his career. And so, even though he passed away in 2005, and he was the towering figure of all Native intellectuals, in my opinion, the most brilliant of Native intellectuals that any country has produced. But people's memory don't last very long, it seems to us. And I'm meeting young Native students now that don't even know the name Vine Deloria, which is one reason that I keep trying to write a book about him as often as I can, with my wife's brilliant help now, because his work was transformative for any country and for other communities who read it. So it's not, I don't know if there's anything unexpected per se, but the people that do learn about him for the first time realize that he really knew so much. He had the most curious mind of anybody I'd ever met. And it was just a fascinating experience to be near him, not unlike my colleagues with John Lewis. In fact, when I studied under Deloria at the University of Arizona, I was part of a small group of Native students that he recruited to get the master's degree with him. And I organized a study group because he would assign us loads of work that no single individual could do. And so we would gather together at my apartment, and we would all study together and work together and think together. And after a while, I began to call us Deloria's disciples. Not because he was a religious figure, even though he had studied religion, but because we knew that if we followed his good ideas, and if we studied hard and trained hard, we would become effective advocates for our nations. And so that's what struck me.
I would have to say what surprised me was the reaction of Eastern tribes. My work, I spent a lot of my time in the West with Western tribes, and so coming to the East, it's been a real education. And I hadn't realized how strongly he had advocated on behalf of tribes in Virginia and North Carolina to receive federal recognition for decades. Testimony before Congress, all kinds of reports. I mean, just the dedication to saying, yeah, there are Indians on the plains with, what we think of as Indian culture, but on the East Coast, those people need help. They need our support. So anyway, that was kind of a...
So Um, I was immersed in this story for 7 years. I started working on it in 2017, and the book came out last October. And, one of the great privileges of my life was getting to spend as much time I did with Nelson and Joyce Johnson, and really affected the way I saw and approached the world, and their evolution to this idea of the transformative power of love and the different kinds of love that we experience as human beings. I mean, the romantic love and brotherly love, and then this idea of agape, right? The sort of goodwill that you extend to people who are your enemies or are far away. And that the way they lived that out was profound for me and affected me deeply and made me extremely grateful that I had chosen to work on this and that they had allowed me to work on this, that they had trusted me. And I didn't really realize when I started this project the degree of trust that I was asking for and the degree to which their stories had been betrayed over and over and over again in journalism. But one of the things that has really struck me as I've taken this book out into the world is the degree to which people still stop short at the word communism, that they become very difficult for them to hear about the human beings and even the ideas behind that word. And that sort of startled me. I thought, geez, when did the wall come down? 1989, here we are, all these years later, and it still causes this sort of icy, nervous, uncomfortable response. And, one of the things I write a lot about in the book is the FBI and how the FBI's fingerprints are all over this history in this moment. And what I discovered as I was researching is at the time, and this was very curious to me for an event that is so little known in the popular imagination, that this was the third largest FBI investigation in our nation's history at the time. There was JFK assassination, Pine Ridge, and Greensboro. And there are a lot of similarities, I think, between why there's so much FBI paper on Pine Ridge and Greensboro. They weren't necessarily trying to solve a case in either of those cases. They were collecting information and intelligence and protecting themselves. And so when I think about that, I think about, we talk about McCarthyism and what we're feeling now. But McCarthy was a drop in the bucket compared to J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover spent half a century instilling fear in us in this country about different ideas, lots of different ideas, not just communism, but Black liberation ideas, Native ideas, environmental ideas, women's liberation ideas, Latino ideas, freedom ideas from lots of different perspectives. And I just hope that what we can do, and that what all of these books can be part of, is thinking so much more deeply and broadly about what America can be and where the ideas to inform who we can be can come from, And because when you look at our history, there's always been resistance to the dominant powers in this country since the very beginning, since the first arrival of white people on these shores. There's been resistance, and that's an equal, if not greater, part of our story. And since our country's founding, every opening we've had of rights and freedoms has come from people on the outside who often get vilified despite the fact that they end up winning a margin of freedom for the rest of us. So that's something I've thought about a lot.
I think it is one of the things that a lot of people don't think about today, is that even during King's lifetime, he was vilified, right? He didn't become this epitome of of the beloved community until he was assassinated, right? And what does that tell us about how our society treats forward thinkers, right? So all of you are notators of history in narrative form. What special challenges did you have in writing these books? Because you were writing books about people that you knew, people that you cared about. Did that present a problem in the presentation of the book? Did that present a problem in being, as academia tells us, we have to be detached in order to present quote unquote both sides, right? Was there a push and pull when you were crafting these stories?
Well, I'll just say it's a serious problem. I think for a professional historian, we want to be balanced and fair and open-minded, but when you know someone, when you know your subject so well, and the moral contrast between your subject and the people who are opposing him is so great.
Yeah.
I think long ago, historians stopped using the term objectivity, and we've adopted over the last 30 or 40 years really in a sense, well, the best thing you can do is to be honest with your audience. Tell them who you are, where you're coming from, why you're asking certain questions, and let them judge you. But I've talked to a lot of other civil rights historians, and you can't pretend that Bull Connor and John Lewis are on the same moral level, right? It's just not possible to write, I think, history that's meaningful and truthful. So I worried about that. I didn't want to turn the book into hagiography, into hero worship. But that's tough when you're dealing with a true hero, an iconic figure.
And true evil.
It's just, so I've decided, well, I just have to present it as I believe it should be and let the critics judge, and whether I overstep myself. I kept looking for a little problems in his personality. He had plenty of people who opposed him, so that's no problem. He was the one civil rights leader who was clearly not a race man. He really didn't like to think in racial terms. He was proud of being African American for sure, but he really believed more in human rights than civil rights per se. And there were a number of cases when he had to choose between, let's say, a white candidate who he thought was really superior and a black candidate who wasn't. And he never hesitated in supporting the white candidate. He took a lot of heat for that. The classic example is he was the only really black leader in Congress who opposed Clarence Thomas when he was put up for the Supreme Court. The Congressional Black Caucus all thought, well, this is great. We'll get another black justice to replace Thurgood Marshall. And John Lewis said, you've got to be kidding. This man is a right-wing extremist. It's a mockery of Thurgood Marshall to say that he's a proper successor. And he took a lot of heat. Of course, they later came back to him and said, you were right. You were definitely right. But he took a lot of heat for it. And he was willing to do that. He always looked at the broader, kind of humanity and the human rights, and he didn't really like identity politics very much. He's very consistent on that.
Yeah, well, the challenges of doing an edited volume are quite different than a single authored monograph, right? Because when my wife and I decided to do the book in the wake, like you said, of George Floyd's murder, in the way both indigenous Minnesotans and African-American Minnesotans stood up and began to come together as allies again, as they did for a good chunk of the civil rights era, we knew we needed to do something. And so then we had to figure out, how do we, given Vine's eclectic past and his interest in everything, how do we find representative authors from all these different disciplines, and how do we organize that? And that was a real challenge. And I've done 2 edited volumes before, and trying to do an edited volume, it really is like herding cats. And they're very different species of cats, right? And so it was a real chore. But my wife did a great job of organizing it once we finally identified all the people that we wanted to contribute, and most of them immediately said, yes, I want to contribute. I want to challenge something that Vine said, because I never thought that he did enough with African-American indigenous relations. He should have said more. He should have written more about that. And so we have a couple pieces that address that and other topics. But Vine was, in terms of the objectivity question, that was never a big thing for Vine or for any of our authors, I don't think. Because as Vine put it in one of his pieces, he said, we might misinterpret something as human beings, but we can never misexperience anything, right? Because every experience that we have touches us in some way, and it influences who we are and who we become. And so our authors all believe that fundamentally too, and so they were all brutally honest in the takes that they took and the topics and the reforms and recommendations that they responded to.
I love that. You can never mis-experience something. That's a bar. That's gold right there.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think I was surprised at how willing people were, as you said, to criticize, because Vine Deloria is such an icon, and people see him as this really funny, fatherly, wise guy, and so people really did dig in and say, yeah, but this is where it's lacking. And that's the whole idea. It's like that's making knowledge alive, not just a bunch of phrases. Like Vine was the first to popularize the word sovereignty for Native people, to really put that into the lexicon, and so that people were able to take on somebody like that and say, yeah, but do more. We can do more with what we have was really gratifying.
From what I gathered from the book, though, that challenge to his own work is exactly what he would have wanted as his legacy.
That's exactly it. Yeah, he would have been really embarrassed if, by a hagiography, right? So
yeah.
So I think a challenge I faced was this mountain of documents, hundreds of thousands of pages of FBI documents, court documents, to try to figure out how to approach. That was one challenge. Another challenge was sort of the relative obscurity of this event in the popular imagination, and yet at the same time, the intensity of the feeling about it in Greensboro. I mean, sort of, very different things, like no knowledge and then hard knowledge, And so I'd go around Greensboro and talk to people, and I tried to talk to basically anyone who would talk to me, who was even remotely connected to this story, and living in Greensboro was a remote connection to the story, or maybe not even remote for a lot of people. And I was spending a lot of time at the beloved community center with the Johnsons and going through their papers and talking with them, and every time I'd walk into this space, it's sort of it used to be an annex to a church. The church is no longer there, and this annex is there, and it's got sort of shabby rugs, and there's an old meeting room that looks a little like half the size of this, but with floors, oak floors like this. And we'd go in and we'd sit, we'd talk, and there are all these pictures. Their friend and collaborator for generations, named Louis Brandon, has printed out all these pictures just on their printer there of the black community over through all the decades in Greensboro, and pasted them to the wall. And so you walk in and there's this immense feeling of community and acceptance of different points of view, of true sort of grassroots democracy, that they host all these meetings for the community that elected officials come to, and everyone gets to talk equally. And so I would get filled up there, and then I'd go out into the community and I'd have these conversations with people who disliked Nelson Johnson so intensely. And they distrusted him, they would say. They would say these things about him. And it was so different, the disjunction between the person I was spending all this time with and learning from, and then going out into the community, and I would hear things like a newspaper editor in Greensboro said to me over lunch, well, no one knows who fired the first shot that day on November 3rd, 1979. I'm like, what do you mean? And you're a newspaper guy. Like, every single shot is pretty much documented, you know? And the first 12 shots were fired by Klansmen and Nazis until a person who happened to have an old Derringer in the communist group finally squeezed off a shot that went nowhere. Who knows where it went? No one knows where it went. Anyway, so that was one experience. I finally got the mayor at the time on the phone, and he just started yelling at me. He wouldn't give me an interview, but he would yell at me that I was wasting everybody's time. And then he said, and that jackass is still down there trying to tear the system down. He wouldn't even say Nelson Johnson by name. And so I would leave these experiences and think, is there some secret I'm missing? Is there something I don't know that they know but they're not telling me? And no, there wasn't. What they were mad at, what they were furious at, was a person who was willing to challenge them in ways that exposed their limitations and their hypocrisy. And he had been doing it for 60 years, and they were fed up with it, you know? And he wouldn't stop. And I thought, after a while, boy, is Greensboro lucky that they have someone like that to try to keep them honest, you know, over a whole lifetime. And I wonder who the next one's going to be.
Yeah. May we all have that. May we all find that. All right, so I have one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I'm going to challenge you. You are very loquacious people, which I love, but I'm going to challenge you. One sentence as an answer. I know, I'm not going to get it. I'm never going to get it, but I'm challenging you. What is the one thing that you want a reader to learn from reading your book? Don't give them an out with a
one sentence. Well, I want them to understand the concept of the beloved community, as John Lewis saw it. And he, I guess it's still the same sentence, that it's a run-on sentence. As he often said, the toughest part of it is to get to a place where you love your enemies as much as you love your friends, that you love them as human beings, that you don't dehumanize them, and that you have a certain amount of respect for them. And of course, I think many of us in the last few months have felt a lot of anger, frustration, outrage, and it's hard to stay on this framework of love. Sometimes I feel bad. I wish John Lewis were still around to keep me on the straight and narrow, but I think talking about him so much has helped a lot in a very dark time.
I'm going to take 2.5 sentences. Deloria won an award. The Indian Country Today newspaper, the leading news organ, as Shelly mentioned, used to give an annual award for the most important native for that year. Vine received the second one, the second year. This was back in 2004, I think it was. And when he got up to accept the award, he immediately thanked everybody else in the room, and he identified all the other people who should have received the award instead of himself. And then he made a statement that just stuck in my head, and it's been with me ever since. He said, I meet a lot of young natives, and they're very serious all the time. They hardly ever smile, they hardly ever laugh. And as Shelly said, he had a cutting-edge sense of humor and a wit that was just unbelievable. But he said, in my generation of leaders, he said, we took issues seriously. We didn't take ourselves seriously. So that's what stuck with me. And he embodied that, and I try to carry on that as best I can.
I think building on the beloved community, the concept you're talking about, the importance of relations across time and across distance, not just with people, but with the earth, and keeping knowledge alive.
Yeah, I think that keeping knowledge alive right now is in itself an act of resistance, and we need to do that. But what I would say is we're at an interesting moment where things are wide open. We're not going back to a status quo the way it was, one way or another. And we need to be open to all sorts of ideas. And so I guess what I take away, because it's something that I had to go through working on this book and what was given to me by the Johnson's Trust, was try to be open to ideas even if they challenge who you think you are. And I think that we need that more than ever right now.
Okay, do we have any questions from our audience? You heard all of this amazing brilliance and you're like, nope, I got it. Yeah.
You all alluded to current political climate. You talked about the threat to doing your kind of work in the future. Do you do this kind of work in the future scholars?
So the question is about asking them to talk about doing their kind of work in the political climate that we are in at the moment.
Well, I would say for the first time in my life, I feel threatened. You know, I feel like my academic freedom was always protected by the universities where I taught, and that I lived in at least a society that idealized democracy and tried to live up to its ideals. And I have colleagues, former colleagues, who tell me, you retired at the right time, you'd probably be in jail right now if you had stayed. I was the head of the ACLU in Florida, and which was an interesting position to have for many years. And it's a very scary time for academics. You probably heard what's been done to New College in Florida. It's just extraordinary. Just the whole place has been destroyed by right-wing extremists, supported by Governor DeSantis. So it's a very scary time for teachers, particularly K through 12 teachers, I think. Certainly in Florida, it's just a disastrous situation that we're trying to fight, but it's tough.
Yes, Donald Trump has always had a real animosity toward indigenous peoples, largely driven by economic interests, right? His gaming interests up in the Northeast. When Native nations began to go into gaming as the one form of economic development that actually worked for them, he saw that as a direct threat to his own empire, and he began to challenge and attack indigenous peoples. His policies in just the last 6 weeks have devastated Indian country already, with the layoffs of Indian health personnel, the shuttering of Native educational institutions, his plans following Project 2025 to attack Native lands for all the resources that they still have, particularly lithium, natural gas, coal, water, you name it. But the irony is that my nation, the Lumbee Nation, we're poised to become fairly recognized finally because a majority of my nation voted for him in this election and in the previous election. So my nation may wind up being linked to his hip while he's dismantling all the architecture and infrastructure across Indian country. So it's a weird time for me right now, mentally and emotionally, because I despise what he's doing, not only to Native people, but to all groups. But my nation, it's been a real interesting few weeks, and the ride is just getting started. So.
Yeah, I think, I don't have a lot to add to that. We've just both been watching with real distress as obviously these plans to undermine sovereignty and to extract Native people's resources, especially like water and lithium, those kind of things are imminent threats. But it is encouraging because a lot of folks in Indian country are prepared to resist and prepared to protect their lands and their cultures.
And one quick addendum before I turn it over. ICE is going onto Native reservations and threatening to deport natives. Where do you deport a native to? Where do we go, right? So I said, if they come after me, I guess they're going to deport me back to North Carolina. I don't know, because that's where my people are from. So that's how crazy it is.
The repercussions of what's going on are hard to fathom, but so many places that are anchors of community like this are going to face challenges, and we need to rally around to support them. And I mean, the thing is, I have another book idea, and this one got support from Virginia Humanities, and it got support from the National Endowment for Humanities, and that's what really made it possible for me to do my work. And I think now, okay, that's how I was going to do the next book too. Now what do I do, right? So, I mean, a lot of people are facing those questions, and but even more importantly, like community hubs, community texture, community, anchors like this that we need to hold on to, because these are going to be incredibly important points of memory and activism and community that we need to nurture us as we go forward.
All right, one last question. That beautiful purple hat in the back, girl, I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, John believed in dialogue. He was a very good listener. He always wanted to know what people thought. But he also believed deeply in nonviolent direct action, that there are times when you have to take the struggle into the streets. And I think he would say we'd better start getting into a lot of good trouble, standing up for what we believe in, being willing to be arrested, on the streets, if necessary, shutting things down, which is what Martin Luther King did. Fill the jails if we have to. I think that's what he'd tell us. He was so thrilled with the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, the last thing he did before he went into the hospital, before he died of pancreatic cancer, is he marshaled his strength to go out to the Black Lives Matter Plaza north of the White House, which Trump is now ordering to try to eliminate it. There's a picture in my book of him with his mask on, waving, and it's just very touching and poignant. But I think he would say we've got to, the time is now to resist in any way we can. I mean, he would never counsel violence, because he thought it was self-destructive, but nonviolence, we need to do what Gandhi did in India. Right? They're trying to destroy our democracy, and we better do something soon. you think he would tell us?
Quickly, because we're over time.
Okay, I'll just say one thing. What Nelson Johnson and Joyce Johnson also would have said, in addition to that, was don't give up on trying to find some common ground, even if it's a small sliver of common ground. And what Nelson always said, walk toward each other. Let's try to work toward each other until we can walk together. And right before he died, they did this March for Unity all across North Carolina, from the mountains to Wilmington. And they marched with white communities and black communities, and the idea was about economic justice and about finding common ground, finding something you could hold on to and agree with together across some of this divisive politics. And I'll just say one quick thing, and I think it's a program that the Virginia Humanities is a little bit involved with. In Pulaski, Virginia, there's this amazing project going on where they are creating a quilt of the 23 families that were part of a lawsuit brought by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1947 to argue for against separate but equal, right? Pulaski, Virginia. This was the first big lawsuit before Brown versus Board of Education. And Thurgood Marshall went there, and now, so you've got 80% of the people, it's a little like the Lumbee, in that county voted for Trump. 50% of the African American people in that county voted for Trump. They're making this quilt, and the women doing the quilting, the stitching, are white women. And the community has come together around this. And it turns out that the current head of the board of the NAACP's family is from Pulaski, and his grandparents were part of the suit, and he didn't know it. And now he's going to go back and give a talk at the unveiling of this quilt on May 31st in Pulaski. And you know, there's something very interesting happening there, right? About this community coming together around their civil rights history. At the same time, they're voting to some ways blow it up, right? But there's some common ground there to hold on to, and I think it's interesting. So we'll see. Local, not just national.
I want to thank our authors for this amazing discussion. Please take a moment to scan the QR code in the back of your brochure